They thought I would seek revenge, that I would raise my voice, slam doors, and demand answers the moment I realized what they had done. But I didn't even lift my head from the table when the truth settled quietly in front of me like a bill no one expected me to read. I simply folded my hands, breathed once, and understood everything had already been taken from me long before that moment. It happened the morning after we buried my husband of 41 years, the house still carrying the faint scent of lilies and sympathy casseroles, the kind neighbors bring when they don't know what else to offer. And I remember standing in the kitchen, staring at the coffee maker as it sputtered its last drops, thinking how strange it was that something so ordinary could continue when my entire world had just stopped. Vanessa was already awake, of course, dressed neatly as always, her blonde hair pulled back, her voice soft but efficient as she moved through the house like it belonged to her, answering calls, organizing papers, speaking to people I hadn't even realized needed to be contacted. And Daniel followed her lead the way he had for years now, quiet, agreeable, distant in a way I had once mistaken for maturity, but now felt something closer to absence. I sat down at the dining table where my husband used to read the newspaper every morning, the same chair still slightly pushed back from the night before, and I noticed a stack of documents placed carefully at my spot, aligned too perfectly to be accidental, and when I reached for them, my hands didn't tremble the way I expected they would. Instead, they moved with a steadiness that surprised me, as if some part of me had already prepared for this long before my mind had caught up. Bank statements, transfer confirmations, authorization forms with signatures that looked like mine if you didn't look too closely, amounts that grew larger with each page, stretching back not days but months, and then years, quiet withdrawals hidden inside ordinary transactions, like someone had been slowly emptying a glass of water one sip at a time, trusting I would never notice the level dropping. I heard Vanessa's voice behind me, light and casual, asking if I needed anything, and I remember thinking how carefully she chose her tone, how perfectly. It balanced concern and control, and I almost admired it in that moment, the discipline it must have taken to maintain such a performance for so long. Daniel stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, his eyes avoiding mine, and that was when I knew the truth had roots deeper than money, deeper than paperwork, something that had been growing quietly in this house while I was busy believing we were still a family. They waited for me to react. I could feel it in the stillness that filled the room, in the way Vanessa's fingers rested lightly against the back of Daniel's arm, a silent signal between them, a readiness for whatever storm they expected me to unleash. But there was no storm, not from me. I placed the papers back on the table, aligned them the way she had, and nodded once as if I had just reviewed something ordinary, something that required no emotion, and in that small, controlled movement, something shifted inside me, something colder, sharper, far more patient than anger. They thought I would fight them in that moment, expose everything, demand explanations, but what they didn't understand was that revenge is loud, messy, immediate, and I had no interest in giving them something so simple, so predictable. Instead, I chose something they would never see coming, something that doesn't rush, doesn't shout, doesn't reveal itself until it's already too late. And as I stood up from that table and walked past them without a single question, I could feel their confusion settle into the space I left behind, because silence, real silence, is not weakness, it is the beginning of control. The house had never felt so quiet, not even the night after we brought Daniel home as a newborn when we were too afraid to sleep, listening for every breath, every small sound. But this silence was different, heavier, like something had settled into the walls and refused to leave. I moved through the room slowly that morning, touching things without really seeing them. The framed photos along the hallway, the worn edge of the armchair where my husband used to sit every evening, the kitchen counter where I had stood thousands of times preparing meals that now felt like they belonged to another life. And all the while I could hear Vanessa in the background, her voice low and controlled as she spoke on the phone, discussing arrangements, accounts, appointments, using phrases that sounded official and final, as if decisions had already been made without me. Daniel stayed close to her, answering when she asked, nodding when she paused, and I watched them from a distance without letting them know I was watching, noticing the small things I had missed before, the way she would glance at him before speaking, the way he would wait for her approval before responding, and it struck me how natural it seemed to them, how practiced. Like a routine they had been performing long before I ever suspected there was something to notice. I made coffee again, even though the pot from earlier was still half full, just to have something to do with my hands, and I poured it into my husband's favorite mug without thinking, the one with the faded blue rim, and I set it on the table in front of his empty chair before realizing what I had done, but I did not move it. I just stood there for a moment and let the stillness settle around it, as if the space he left behind deserved to remain undisturbed a little longer. Vanessa eventually joined me, her footsteps soft but deliberate, and she offered a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes, asking if I had slept, if I needed anything, if there was something she could take care of for me, and I answered simply, calmly, the way I always had, giving her nothing more than she asked for, no extra words, no emotion she could measure or use. And I could see the brief flicker of uncertainty in her expression before it disappeared again behind that careful composure. The documents from earlier remained exactly where I had left them, untouched, as if they were waiting for me to return and react, to acknowledge what they represented, but I did not give them that satisfaction. I let them sit there like any other stack of papers, ordinary, unimportant, even though I now understood they were anything but. Instead, I began to notice other things, smaller details that once would have slipped past me. The missing folder from the desk in the study, the way certain drawers were now locked when they had never been before, the subtle change in the rhythm of the house, as if it no longer belonged to me, but to a system that had been quietly installed around me, piece by piece, while I was busy believing in something that no longer existed. I did not confront them, not when Vanessa mentioned needing to review some financial matters later in the week. Not when Daniel suggested it might be a good idea to simplify things, to make everything easier for me. And I almost smiled at that word, easier, because I finally understood what it meant in their language. It meant smaller, quieter, removed, and I let them believe I accepted that. I let them believe I did not see the direction they were guiding me toward. That afternoon, I sat alone in the living room with the curtains half drawn, the light filtering in softly across the carpet, and I allowed myself to think. Not about what I had lost, but about what remained, about what was still within my reach. And for the first time since the funeral, my thoughts were not clouded by grief but sharpened by something else, something steady and deliberate. And I realized that whatever they had taken, whatever they believed they controlled, they had made one critical mistake. They assumed I would react the way they expected, that I would follow the script they had written for me, but I had no intention of doing that. Not now, not ever. It was not a single moment that revealed everything to me, but a series of small, quiet details that began to line up with a precision that felt impossible to ignore, like pieces of a puzzle that had always been there, but only now arranged themselves into something undeniable. Later that afternoon, while Vanessa was upstairs on another call, and Daniel had stepped out to run what he described as a quick errand, I walked into the study, a room that had always belonged more to my husband than to anyone else. And I noticed immediately that something was different, not in a dramatic way, but in the kind of subtle shift that only someone who had lived in a space for decades would recognize. The angle of the desk chair, the absence of a folder that used to sit neatly in the top drawer, the faint outline where a stack of papers had once been kept. I opened the drawer slowly, not because I was afraid, but because I did not want to disturb whatever pattern had been established in my absence, and inside I found what I expected, and what I did not expect at the same time, documents rearranged, some missing, others replaced with copies that looked official at a glance, but carried a certain stiffness in their presentation, as if they had been assembled quickly to fill a space that should not have been empty. I did not rush, I did not react. I simply took note, closing the drawer exactly as I had found it, my fingers resting briefly on the handle as I allowed the realization to settle fully into place. This had not been an impulsive act. It had been planned, organized, executed over time with care and patience, the same qualities I had once believed defined our family in a very different way. When Daniel returned, I heard his voice in the hallway, low and casual, asking Vanessa if everything was taken care of, and her response came just as quietly, a simple yes that carried more meaning than the word itself, and I remained where I was, just out of sight, listening not for what they said, but for how they said it. The ease, the familiarity, The absence of hesitation that only comes when something has been rehearsed enough to feel natural. That evening, we sat down for dinner at the same table where we had shared countless meals over the years, and Vanessa served the food with the same practiced grace she always had, placing dishes carefully, asking if everything looked all right, maintaining the image of normalcy with a precision that might have been impressive if it were not so deliberate. And Daniel spoke about small things, the weather, a project at work, anything that would keep the conversation safely away from anything that mattered. I responded in kind, my voice steady, my words measured, offering just enough to maintain the appearance of engagement without revealing anything beneath the surface, and I could see it in the way Vanessa watched me when she thought I was not looking, a quiet calculation, as if she was waiting for something to break, something to confirm that I had seen what I was not supposed to see. But nothing broke, not then, not in that moment, because I had already begun to understand that whatever they had set in motion depended on my reaction, on my willingness to play the role they had prepared for me, and without that, their plan would have to continue without the clarity they expected. After dinner, I returned to the living room and sat in the same chair I had occupied earlier, the room dim except for a single lamp casting a soft light across the carpet, and I replayed everything in my mind, not as a victim trying to make sense of a loss, but as someone observing a pattern, identifying its structure, its weak points, and its assumptions, and the most important of those assumptions was me, what I would do, how I would respond, what they believed I was capable of, and in that understanding, I found something that felt almost like clarity, a path forward that did not require confrontation or explanation, only patience, because the more I saw, the more certain I became that the truth they were trying so carefully to manage was not nearly as controlled as they believed, and all it would take was time for it to reveal itself completely. That night, I did not sleep the way I used to, not with the comfort of knowing tomorrow would be familiar, but with a kind of quiet awareness that kept my mind moving even as the house remained still, and sometime around 3 a.m, I found myself standing in the hallway outside the bedroom that used to belong to Daniel when he was a boy, the door slightly open, the light inside faint, and I could hear Vanessa's voice again, softer now, almost careful, as if she believed the walls might be listening, and I did not step closer, I did not need to, because the tone alone told me enough, controlled, assured, not the voice of someone uncertain or afraid, but of someone who believed everything was proceeding exactly as planned. I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the space beside me that had once been filled, and for a moment I allowed myself to remember, not out of longing, but out of necessity, because understanding the past was the only way to see clearly what had been changing over time, and I began to revisit moments that had once seemed harmless, small decisions, conversations I had dismissed, shifts in behavior that I had explained away as stress or circumstance, and now each of them carried a different weight, a different meaning, as if I were finally reading a language I had spent years ignoring. Vanessa had always been attentive in the beginning, thoughtful in ways that made it easy to trust her, remembering details, offering help before it was asked, positioning herself as someone who cared deeply about the family, and I had welcomed that, perhaps too easily, because it felt like continuity, like the kind of support every mother hopes her son will find in a partner, and Daniel had changed gradually, not in ways that demanded attention, but in ways that were easy to excuse, less frequent calls, shorter conversations, a tendency to defer decisions that he once would have discussed openly, and I had told myself it was part of life, part of growing older, part of letting go. But now, sitting there in the quiet of that early morning, I could see how those changes had not been random. They had been consistent, directed, subtle enough to avoid suspicion, but steady enough to reshape everything around them. And I realized that what I was witnessing now was not the beginning of something. It was the result of something that had been unfolding for a long time. The next morning, I followed my usual routine without deviation. I made breakfast, I set the table, I moved through the house with the same measured pace I had always maintained, and Vanessa watched me again, just briefly, as if she were checking for cracks, for signs that I might have noticed more than I was supposed to, and I gave her nothing, not even a question, not even a hesitation, and in that absence, I could see her confidence return, settling back into place as if reassured by my silence. Daniel mentioned needing to review some paperwork later in the week. Something about simplifying accounts, making things more manageable, and I nodded as if the suggestion made perfect sense, because I understood now that these were not new ideas. They were steps in a process that had already begun, and the only variable left in their plan was me. I spent the rest of the day observing, not in an obvious way, but in the quiet manner that comes from familiarity, noticing how often Vanessa checked her phone, how quickly Daniel responded when she spoke, how certain topics were avoided entirely, and each detail added to the pattern that was becoming clearer with every passing hour. By the time evening came again, I no longer felt uncertain about what was happening. I no longer questioned whether I had misunderstood something or imagined it differently than it was, because the consistency of their behavior left no room for doubt. And with that clarity came something else, something steadier than anger, something that did not demand immediate action but instead encouraged patience, because I understood now that whatever they believed they controlled depended entirely on what they thought I would do next, and as long as I remained exactly as they expected me to be, quiet, compliant, unaware, they would continue exactly as they had been, revealing more with each step they took, and that was something I intended to allow. By the third day, the pattern was no longer something I had to search for. It presented itself in quiet, predictable ways, as if the house itself had adjusted to a rhythm that excluded me without ever needing to say so. And I found that the more I stepped back, the more clearly everything revealed itself, not in dramatic moments, but in the ordinary exchanges that filled the day, the kind most people would overlook without a second thought. That morning, Vanessa mentioned an appointment with a financial advisor, her tone light, almost casual, as if it were something that had only just been arranged, but the way Daniel nodded before she finished the sentence told me otherwise. It was already decided, already set in motion, and I was being informed only because it would seem unusual not to include me at all. I responded with the same calm acknowledgement I had given everything else, a simple nod, a quiet agreement, offering no resistance, no curiosity, and in doing so, I watched the tension leave her shoulders, just slightly, just enough to confirm what I had begun to understand. They were not afraid of what I knew. They were afraid of how I would react, and without that reaction, their certainty had nothing to push against. Later, when Vanessa stepped out to take a call and Daniel moved to the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water, I followed at a distance that felt natural, not intrusive, and I saw him pause for a moment, staring at the countertop as if weighing something in his mind, and for the briefest second, I thought he might say something, that he might look at me and explain, or apologize, or even hesitate, but instead he simply exhaled, picked up his glass, and walked away without a word, and in that silence, I found the confirmation I did not know I was waiting for. This was not confusion, not a mistake, not something that had gone too far by accident. It was a choice. Repeated, reinforced, and accepted. In the afternoon, I returned to the study again, not to search, but to observe, to confirm what I had already seen, and this time I noticed something new. A set of files placed neatly on the corner of the desk, labeled in a way that appeared official but carried a subtle inconsistency. A date that did not align with the timeline I knew to be true, a signature that was slightly too uniform, as if it had been practiced rather than written naturally, and I did not touch them, I did not move anything. I simply let the information settle into place alongside everything else I had gathered, building a picture that was no longer fragmented but complete. That evening, as we sat together again, the conversation felt even more controlled than before, each topic chosen carefully, each response measured, and I realized that they were not just managing the situation, they were managing me, guiding the flow of interaction in a way that kept everything within their expectations, and the more I allowed it, the more comfortable they became, the more certain they were that their plan was unfolding without interruption. I found myself listening more than speaking, watching more than reacting, and in that quiet observation, something shifted again, not in them, but in me. Because I no longer felt the need to understand why they had done this. The reasons no longer mattered. What mattered was how they believed it would end, and more importantly, how easily they assumed that end would come without resistance. As the night settled and the house grew quiet once more, I sat alone in the living room, the same soft light casting familiar shadows across the floor, and I allowed myself one final moment of reflection, not on the loss, not on the betrayal, but on the opportunity hidden within it. Because what they had created was not just a situation, it was a structure, one built on assumptions about me, my behavior, my limits, and structures like that, no matter how carefully designed, always have a point where they can be undone, not through force, not through confrontation, but through patience and precision. And for the first time since everything had begun to reveal itself, I understood exactly where that point might be. The decision was not something I announced, not even to myself in words. It settled quietly into place the same way everything else had, with a kind of calm certainty that did not need to be spoken to be real. And from that moment on, I stopped reacting entirely and began observing with purpose. The difference was subtle from the outside, but to me it changed everything, because I was no longer trying to understand what they had done. I was preparing for what they would do next. The appointment Vanessa had mentioned came sooner than expected, scheduled for late morning at an office downtown. And she presented it as something routine, something meant to simplify matters for me, to help organize accounts and ensure everything was in order after my husband's passing. And I agreed without hesitation, my voice steady, my expression unchanged, giving her no reason to question whether I would follow through exactly as she expected. The drive there was quiet, Daniel focused on the road, Vanessa occasionally checking her phone, and I sat in the back seat watching the city pass by. Familiar streets that suddenly felt distant, as if I were seeing them from a different life, and I realized that this was the first time they had included me directly in whatever process they had set in motion, not because they needed me, but because they needed something from me. The office itself was clean, professional, the kind of place designed to inspire trust without drawing attention to itself, and the man who greeted us introduced himself with practiced confidence, his handshake firm, his smile measured. And I noted the way Vanessa addressed him, not as someone new, but with a familiarity that suggested previous conversations, previous agreements that had already shaped what would happen next. We sat down, documents were placed in front of me, explanations were given in careful, simplified language, phrases like streamlining, consolidation, ease of management, all presented as benefits, all framed in a way that assumed agreement before I had even spoken. And I listened without interruption, my hands resting lightly on the table, my eyes moving across the pages without lingering too long on any single detail, because I already understood the purpose of this meeting was not to inform me. It was to secure something from me, something that would finalize what they had been building behind the scenes. When the moment came for me to respond, I did exactly what they expected. I nodded. I asked a small, harmless question about timing, about how long these changes would take to process. And I watched as the man answered with reassurance. While Vanessa's posture relaxed just slightly, her confidence returning as she interpreted my behavior as acceptance. And in that moment, I gave them what they needed most, not a signature, not yet, but the belief that I would provide it when asked. We left the office with everything still appearing unresolved, more steps to follow, more documents to review, and I could sense a quiet satisfaction in both of them. A certainty that things were progressing exactly as planned, and I allowed that certainty to remain untouched, because it was more valuable to me than any immediate action I could have taken. That afternoon, back at the house, I moved through the same routines as before, but now each action carried intention, each moment observed with a clarity that had not been there days earlier, and I began to take note of specific details, the names on documents, the structure of accounts, the sequence in which decisions were being presented, building a framework in my mind that mirrored the one they believed they controlled. I did not rush, I did not confront, I did not reveal anything I had seen or understood, because I knew now that time was not working against me. It was working for me, and the more they continued without interruption, the more complete their plan would become, and the more complete it became, the easier it would be to see exactly where it could be undone. By the end of that week, their confidence had settled into something almost comfortable, the kind of quiet certainty that comes when people believe there is nothing left to question, and I could see it. In the way Vanessa moved through the house without hesitation, the way she spoke about future plans as if they were already guaranteed, and the way Daniel no longer avoided my gaze quite as often, as though whatever doubt he might have felt had been replaced by a belief that everything would resolve exactly as they intended. I allowed that comfort to grow, because it served me better than any confrontation ever could, and I began to make small adjustments of my own. Changes so subtle they blended into the routine of daily life, unnoticed, unremarkable, but deliberate in ways that only I understood. I started with the simplest things, organizing my own records, reviewing statements I had not looked at in years, taking note of account numbers, dates, and signatures, not as someone trying to recover what had been lost, but as someone mapping the structure of something much larger, something that required precision to understand fully. When Vanessa mentioned that we would need to return to the office to finalize a few remaining details, I agreed without question, my tone even, my expression calm, and I could see the satisfaction in her eyes, the confirmation she had been waiting for, that I was moving exactly where she expected me to move, following the path she believed she had set for me. That evening, I made a phone call of my own, not from the main line in the house, but from the small device I kept in my room, one I had rarely used before, and I spoke quietly, carefully, providing only the information necessary, asking only the questions that mattered, and when the call ended, I felt something settle into place, not relief, not yet, but a sense of alignment, as if the pieces I had been observing were finally beginning to form something actionable. The next day, I continued as I always had, preparing meals, maintaining the rhythm of the household, giving no indication that anything had changed beneath the surface, and Vanessa responded in kind, her demeanor steady, her tone confident, occasionally offering suggestions about how we might simplify things further, how certain responsibilities could be transferred, how certain decisions could be made on my behalf, always framed as assistance, always presented as care, and I accepted each suggestion with the same quiet acknowledgement, allowing her to believe that her influence was complete. Daniel, for his part, seemed more at ease than he had been in days, his conversations lighter, his presence less guarded, and I wondered briefly if he had convinced himself that what they were doing was necessary, perhaps even justified, but I did not dwell on that thought, because understanding his reasoning no longer served a purpose. What mattered was the role he played and the choices he continued to make. As the second appointment approached, the atmosphere in the house shifted slightly, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone else, but in the subtle tightening of expectations, the quiet anticipation of something being finalized, and I recognized it immediately, the sense that they were nearing the end of whatever process they had begun, that soon there would be nothing left to secure, nothing left to confirm. I prepared for that moment not with resistance, but with readiness, reviewing everything I had gathered, every detail I had noted, every assumption they had made about me, and I understood that the strength of their plan rested entirely on those assumptions remaining true. That evening, as I sat alone once more, the house dim and still around me, I allowed myself a brief, quiet acknowledgement of what was coming, not with fear, not with anger, but with a clarity that felt almost distant, because I knew that when the moment arrived, it would not be defined by what they expected from me, but by what they had never considered possible, and until then, I would remain exactly as they believed me to be, quiet, patient, and entirely under their control. The morning of the second appointment arrived with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the house itself understood that something was about to be concluded, and I followed my routine with the same quiet precision I had maintained all week, making coffee, setting the table, moving through each task without hesitation or delay, because consistency was the one thing they trusted most about me, and I had no intention of changing that now. Vanessa was already prepared before I finished in the kitchen, her posture composed, her expression calm in a way that suggested everything was under control, and Daniel stood beside her, adjusting his jacket, avoiding the kind of eye contact that might invite a question he did not want to answer, and I noticed how natural it all seemed to them, how easily they moved within a plan they believed was nearing its final step. The drive to the office felt shorter than before, the conversation minimal, limited to small observations about traffic and timing, and I responded in the same measured way, offering nothing that would disrupt the balance they had grown comfortable with, because by now I understood that their confidence was the most important part of what was about to happen. When we arrived, the same man greeted us with the same practiced smile, his tone professional, his gestures precise, and I could see the subtle shift in his demeanor, a readiness that had not been there during the first meeting, as if today carried more weight, more finality, and when we sat down, the documents presented to me were no longer preliminary, They were complete, organized, prepared for a conclusion that had already been outlined in conversations I had not been part of. Vanessa guided the discussion with quiet authority, referencing points that had clearly been agreed upon in advance, and Daniel followed along, adding small confirmations where necessary, and I listened without interruption, my attention focused not only on what was being said, but on how it was being presented, the sequence of information, the assumptions built into each explanation, the expectation that I would accept everything without resistance. When the moment came, the papers were placed directly in front of me, a pen set carefully beside them, and the room grew just slightly quieter, not in an obvious way, but in the subtle pause that occurs when people are waiting for something they believe is inevitable. And I allowed that pause to exist. I did not rush to fill it. I did not reach for the pen immediately. I simply looked at the documents with the same calm expression I had carried throughout, letting the silence extend just long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to create suspicion. Then, slowly, I lifted my hand, not toward the pen, but toward the edge of the papers, aligning them carefully, as if preparing to review them once more, and I asked a single question, simple, direct, about a detail that seemed minor on the surface, but required clarification, and I watched as the man responded, his answer precise but slightly rehearsed, Vanessa's posture tightening for just a moment before she relaxed. Again, reassured by the fact that I had not refused, had not objected, had not disrupted the process. I nodded, as if satisfied, and allowed the conversation to move forward, giving them exactly what they expected, cooperation without resistance, acceptance without hesitation, and in that moment, I could feel the structure they had built reaching what they believed was its completion, every step aligned, every assumption confirmed. But beneath that surface, something else had already been set in motion, something they had not accounted for, because while they had been guiding me toward this outcome, I had been preparing for it in a very different way, and as I finally reached for the pen, holding it lightly between my fingers, I understood that the moment they believed would secure everything for them was, in fact, the moment everything would begin to shift in a direction they had never considered. The pen felt lighter than I expected, resting between my fingers as if it carried no weight at all, and for a brief moment, I allowed them to believe that everything had unfolded exactly as they had planned, that this simple gesture would complete what they had started, and I could see it in their expressions, in the quiet anticipation that filled the room, in the way Vanessa's eyes remained fixed on the page while Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, waiting for the final step that would confirm their control. I lowered the pen slowly, not to sign, but to place it gently beside the document, and in that small, deliberate motion, something changed, not in the room itself, but in the expectation that had been built so carefully around me. And I looked up, meeting Vanessa's gaze for the first time without looking away, my expression calm, unchanged, but no longer passive in the way she had come to rely on. I spoke quietly, my voice steady, asking if we could pause for a moment, just to clarify one last detail, and before either of them could respond, I reached into my bag and placed a separate folder on the table, one that had not been part of their arrangement, one that did not belong to the sequence they had constructed, and I watched as the man across from us hesitated, just slightly, before opening it. The shift was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of silence that does not come from waiting, but from recalculating, and I remained still, allowing that silence to expand without interruption, because this was not a moment for explanation, it was a moment for recognition. The documents inside were not dramatic, not loud, but precise, aligned, prepared with the same level of care they had applied to their own, and as the man reviewed them, his expression changed in ways he tried to conceal, his posture adjusting, his tone becoming more measured when he finally spoke, no longer leading the conversation, but responding to it, and I could see Vanessa's confidence begin to falter, not outwardly, not in a way that would draw attention, but in the smallest details, the way her hands remained just a second too still, the way her eyes moved more quickly across the page than before. Daniel said nothing, and that silence told me more than anything he could have said, because it confirmed what I had understood all along, that his certainty had never been as strong as hers, only easier to follow. I did not explain everything. I did not list what I had seen or how I had prepared, because none of that was necessary. The structure they had built depended on control, on direction, on the assumption that I would follow, and once that assumption was removed, everything else began to shift on its own. The meeting ended differently than they had expected, not with a signature, not with a conclusion they could secure, but with a pause, a reconsideration, and a quiet acknowledgement that the process was no longer theirs to manage alone, and I stood when it was over, gathering my things with the same calm precision I had shown from the beginning, giving them nothing more than a brief nod before turning toward the door. The drive back was silent, heavier than before, but I did not fill it with questions, I did not seek explanations, because I no longer needed them, and when we arrived at the house, I stepped inside without waiting, moving through the familiar space with a clarity that had not been there days earlier, not because anything had been restored, but because everything had been seen for what it was. That evening, I sat in the living room once more, the same chair, the same quiet light, but the stillness felt different now, not empty, not uncertain, but resolved in a way that did not require closure, and I understood then that what they had expected from me had never been strength. It had been reaction, something immediate and visible that they could anticipate and control, but what I had chosen instead required none of that. It required patience, attention, and the willingness to remain still long enough to see everything clearly, and in that stillness, I had found something far more final than any confrontation could ever provide.